the entire power grid collapsed. A billion-dollar launch was seconds from disaster, and the ruthless CEO laughed at one quiet single dad and said, "Fix it in 1 hour, and I'll kiss you in front of everyone." She thought she was humiliating him. She had no idea. He was about to humble her in front of the whole world. Madeline Pierce hadn't built her empire on kindness. At 34, she was the youngest CEO in Axiom Energy's history, a position she'd clawed her way to with relentless ambition and an almost inhuman detachment. On the stock market floor, they called her the Ice Queen, a title she wore like a crown of thorns she had sharpened herself. Her world was a fortress of glass and steel overlooking a city that felt like her personal chessboard. Her days were a blur of calculated risks, hostile takeovers, and quarterly reports that she dissected with surgical precision. Emotion, in her meticulously curated existence, was a variable she had long ago eliminated. It was a weakness, a flaw in the code, a ghost in the machine. This coldness was her shield, forged in the crucible of a difficult childhood. Her domineering father, a titan of industry himself, saw love as a liability and success as the only currency worth collecting. He'd taught her that to want was to be weak, that affection was a transaction, and that the only victory that mattered was the one that left your opponent crushed. So, she had trained herself to want nothing but absolute, undeniable victory. The Triton project was supposed to be her masterpiece, the coronation of her reign. It wasn't just a product. It was a revolutionary decentralized energy system poised to rewrite the future of power grids across the globe and, more importantly, to finally cement her legacy beyond her father's long shadow. It was a multi-billion-dollar gamble, the culmination of 5 years of 18-hour days, sacrificed relationships, and relentless work. Its success rested entirely on this one launch, this one moment. Failure wouldn't just be a professional setback. It would be a public execution of her career, a spectacular implosion broadcast for the entire world to see. It would be a feast for her competitors, who circled Axiom like vultures, and it would deliver a deep, satisfying "I told you so" from the one man whose approval she unconsciously still craved and could never truly attain. Now, the generator, the $12 million custom-built heart of the entire system, was a silent, mocking monument to her impending humiliation, and as her hand-picked six-figure salary engineers ran around like headless chickens, their expensive educations rendered worthless, Madeline felt a familiar, cold rage building in the pit of her stomach. It was the only emotion she ever allowed herself, the fuel that had powered her ascent. In stark, profound contrast was the quiet, ordered, and infinitely richer life of Daniel Reed. To the executive floor, he was functionally invisible, a name on a maintenance roster, a man who clocked in, did his job with a focused competence that bordered on artistry, and clocked out at 5 p.m. sharp. But Daniel wasn't just a man with a toolbox and a blue-collar uniform. He was a former lieutenant colonel in the Army Corps of Engineers, a man who had spent 15 years leading teams in the most unforgiving environments on Earth, in places where a single mistake didn't just cost millions of dollars but cost lives. He had learned to listen to the language of machinery. He knew a machine's anatomy like a doctor knew the human body, sensing the subtle tremor that preceded a catastrophic failure, hearing the off-key hum of a struggling bearing. That preternatural calm that so unnerved Madeline now had been drilled into him in the sun-scorched deserts of Afghanistan, honed in the chaos of forward operating bases where the lights had to stay on. He'd left that life of high stakes and high stress behind for a mission he considered infinitely more important, being a dad. After his wife, Emily, passed away from a sudden illness, his entire world, once spanning continents, shrank to the size of his 7-year-old daughter, Sophie. She was his entire universe, the sun his life orbited. His job at Axiom Energy wasn't a career path. It was the bedrock on which he built their small, stable world. It was how he paid for Sophie's school supplies, the mortgage on their modest suburban home, and the ballet lessons she adored with every fiber of her being. His hands, which had once field-stripped and repaired engines in the middle of firefights, now spent their evenings patiently untangling knotted shoelaces, fixing broken dolls with surgical care, and braiding his daughter's long brown hair. His world wasn't one of cold ambition and stock prices, but of profound, unwavering, unconditional love. And it was this world, the face of his smiling daughter, that he was thinking of when the CEO's chilling, arrogant challenge echoed through the panicked control room. The air in the control room was thick with the smell of ozone, burnt electronics, and rising despair. The generator, a gleaming beast of chrome and copper wiring that took up a third of the room, was ominously silent. A bank of monitors that should have been displaying the lifeblood of the Triton system were blank, their darkness a reflection of the team's cluelessness. Alarms that had blared moments ago were now dead, their silence even more terrifying than the noise. Madeline's top engineers, men with PhDs from MIT, Stanford, and Caltech, were shouting jargon at each other, their theories growing more desperate and arcane by the minute. "It has to be a cascade failure in the primary bus," one yelled. "No, the logic board is completely fried. It's not responding to any diagnostic," another shot back. They had designed this machine on advanced computer models, but faced with its physical reality, they were utterly, humiliatingly blind. It was in this vortex of chaos that Madeline's gaze found Daniel. He wasn't panicked, he wasn't frantically consulting a tablet or shouting theories. He was just standing near the main access panel, his arms loosely crossed, looking at the generator. His head was tilted, his focus so intense it was as if he was listening to a conversation no one else could hear, a story the silent machine was telling only to him. Contempt and desperation are a dangerous cocktail, and Madeline was drunk on both. Seeing his stillness not as calm, but as insolence, a blue-collar worker's passive-aggressive refusal to join the panic, she made her move. She strode toward him, her heels clicking an aggressive, staccato rhythm on the polished concrete floor. The room, sensing the shift in focus, fell silent. The engineer stopped shouting, turning to watch the impending collision. "You're Daniel Reed, right? Head of maintenance," she stated. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. Daniel finally pulled his eyes from the machine and gave a simple, almost imperceptible nod. His gaze was neutral, patient, revealing nothing. "My Ivy League geniuses," she began, her voice dripping with scorn as she gestured to the assembled team of engineers, "seem to be having a problem. They tell me you have a reputation, a machine whisperer, a miracle worker." She began to circle him slowly, a predator sizing up its prey, enjoying the theater of it all. "I find that hard to believe, but I'm out of options." She stopped directly in front of him, invading his personal space. "So, let's make this interesting. The launch is at 2 p.m. It's noon now. You have 2 hours. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the generator. "Fix my $12 million paperweight." She paused, letting the tension hang heavy and thick in the air, "and I'll kiss you right now in front of everyone." A few executives and engineers snickered nervously. It was a cruel, mocking spectacle, a game designed to put the lowly mechanic in his place before he inevitably failed. Then came the hammer, her voice dropping to an arctic whisper that was far more terrifying than her shouting. "Fail," she said, locking her eyes onto his, "and you're fired. Your security clearance will be revoked before the clock strikes 2. She was dangling his entire life, the job that paid for his daughter's food, her shelter, her ballet lessons, like a cheap casino chip, and she expected him to grovel for the chance to play. Daniel finally tore his gaze from the generator and met her eyes directly. For the first time, Madeline saw something in them that wasn't just calm, but an unshakable certainty. There was no fear there, no anger, no desperation, just a quiet, unreadable focus. He looked at the powerful woman in her perfectly tailored suit, a woman who thought she was offering the ultimate carrot and the ultimate stick. Then he looked back at the dead machine. He took a deep breath, and for a fleeting moment, the room felt less like a corporate headquarters and more like a field operations base about to go live. He was no longer Daniel Reed, maintenance guy. He was Lieutenant Colonel Reed, and he had a mission objective. Without a flicker of emotion, he gave another small nod. "I'll need the room cleared," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "And I'll need complete silence." He didn't wait for her permission. He turned his back on the most powerful woman in the building, walked to his rolling tool cart, and began to pull on a pair of worn, oil-stained leather gloves. The show was over. It was time to get to work. The room cleared with a murmur of discontent and disbelief, leaving only Madeline and a few of her key executives watching from a glass-walled observation deck above the control room floor. The engineers who had failed so spectacularly now stood with their arms crossed, whispering and scoffing, their pride wounded. They were ready, almost eager, to watch the mechanic fail too, to validate their own incompetence. "He's going to check the fuses," one of them sneered. "This is a joke." But Madeline watched with a different kind of intensity. She expected to see him fumbling, guessing, a display of hopeless futility that would justify the cold rage she felt. She was profoundly, utterly wrong. Daniel moved with a mesmerizing economy of motion that was almost beautiful to watch. There was no wasted energy, no frantic searching, no panicked second-guessing. He began by placing a bare hand on the generator's cold metal casing, closing his eyes for a full 10 seconds. He wasn't praying, he was feeling, searching for the ghost of a vibration, a residual heat signature, a subtle tell that the machine's physical body would offer up. Then his real diagnosis began. He didn't rip open panels at random like the others had. He unrolled a set of laminated schematics, the very same ones the engineers had stared at blankly, and with a calloused but steady finger began to trace the entire power flow from the external grid input. His lips moved silently, a quiet conversation between him and the blueprint. His process was a dance of pure logic and deep intuition. He pulled a high-end multimeter from his cart and began testing a series of nodes, his movements precise and methodical. The readings flashed on the small screen, numbers that had meant nothing to the panicked engineers who were looking for a catastrophic software bug. But to Daniel, they were telling a story. He saw not a system crash, but a choke point. The power was coming in, but it wasn't getting through a specific circuit. Madeline found herself leaning forward against the glass, her arms uncrossing, her scorn slowly dissolving into a reluctant, unnerving curiosity. She'd seen confidence before. She weaponized it daily. But this was different. This wasn't the loud, bragging, peacocking confidence of her executives. This was a deep, quiet certainty that emanated from a man who had absolute, unshakable faith in his skills. She watched as he completely bypassed the main motherboard, the $6 million brain that everyone had been obsessed with. Instead, he went straight to a secondary power regulator unit, a component buried deep within the machine's guts, shielded behind 3 separate access plates. He worked a specialized angled wrench into a space barely wide enough for his hand and, with a firm, practiced twist, removed a small, blackened capacitor. It was a $10 part inside a $12 million machine, a part so insignificant, so deeply hidden in a non-critical subsystem that the high-level design engineers had completely overlooked it in their panic. He held it up to the light, inspected its scorched casing with a nod of confirmation, and replaced it with a fresh one from a neatly organized case in his cart. His movements were deft, sure, and completely focused. As he reconnected the final wire and secured the last panel, he glanced up at the large digital clock on the wall. 1:58 p.m. He took a single step back, wiped a smear of grease from his brow with the back of his gloved hand, and nodded once to the control room technician who had remained at his station. "Try it now." A single button was pressed. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. The silence was absolute. Then a low hum began, a resonant frequency that vibrated through the floor. The hum escalated into a powerful, steady roar, the sound of a waking giant. The lights in the control room flickered once, then burned brightly. The main screen for the Triton project, the size of a small cinema, flared to life, its brilliant blue Axiom logo radiating power and success. The launch was saved. A wave of stunned silence washed over the observation deck before it was broken by a single engineer whispering, "No way. It can't be." Then the room erupted in a cacophony of cheers, applause, and relieved shouts. Daniel didn't join in. He didn't even smile. He simply turned back to his cart and began wiping down his tools with a clean rag, carefully putting each one back in its designated slot. His job was done. Madeline was frozen, her mind struggling to process what she had just witnessed. This man, this nobody from the maintenance department, had just single-handedly saved her entire legacy with a calm she had never witnessed in any boardroom or battlefield of business. She descended the stairs, her steps far less certain than they had been 2 hours ago, and crossed the floor as the jubilant crowd parted for her. She stopped directly in front of him. The room went quiet again, everyone waiting for the promised spectacle. "A deal's a deal," she said, her voice a strange, breathy version of itself, the practiced authority completely gone. Daniel finished packing his last wrench and finally looked up, his gaze steady and clear. He didn't look at her lips. He looked her right in the eye, a look that held no judgment, only a quiet finality. Then, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet, flipping it open to a faded, crinkled photograph of a little girl with a gap-toothed smile, wearing a pink ballet tutu, her arms raised in a triumphant pose. "I just did my job, Ms. Pierce," he said, his voice quiet but echoing in the silent, cavernous room. "My reward is making sure she has a roof over her head tonight and that I can be there to see her dance recital next week. I don't need anything else." He closed his wallet, gave her a polite, almost dismissive nod, and pushed his tool cart toward the exit, leaving the Ice Queen of Axiom Energy standing alone in the center of the room, utterly, profoundly speechless. For the first time in her life, Madeline Pierce, a woman who got everything she ever wanted, had been turned down. And in that silent, public moment of refusal, she felt her perfectly constructed world of power and control crack right down the middle. The Triton launch was a phenomenal, historic success. The markets roared their approval, Axiom stock soared to an all-time high, and the press hailed Madeline as a generational visionary. Her father even sent a curt, one-word text message: adequate, by every metric she had ever valued: profit, prestige, power. It was the greatest victory of her career. Yet, it all felt hollow, like biting into a beautiful wax apple. The popping of champagne corks at the impromptu celebration in the boardroom, the fawning praise from her board of directors, the sycophantic congratulations from the very engineers who had failed her. It was all just noise, a meaningless frequency she could no longer tune into. The only thing that echoed in the sudden silence of her mind was Daniel's quiet, devastating refusal. "I don't need anything else." The words haunted her. They followed her from the boardroom to her chauffeured car, and from the car to her sprawling, minimalist penthouse apartment. In her world, everyone needed something. It was the fundamental law of human physics as she understood it. Money, power, recognition, approval, sex. These were the levers she pulled to make the world bend to her will. Her entire strategy for managing people, for building her empire, was based on finding what they needed and using it as a tool or a weapon. But Daniel Reed operated on a different frequency, a different plane of existence. His rejection wasn't an insult. It was a fundamental challenge to her entire worldview. He hadn't just refused her kiss. He had rendered her power, her currency, her very identity utterly worthless. And it drove her to the edge of madness. An obsession took root, a burning need to understand the man who had so effortlessly dismantled her. The next day, the termination order she had planned to sign sat untouched on her desk. Instead, she pulled his employee file. The sparse details, former lieutenant colonel, decorated for valor, widowed, single father, only painted a faint, intriguing outline. It wasn't enough. That night, alone in her glass-walled office high above the sleeping city, she did something she had never done before. She pried. She ran a discreet, comprehensive background check, feeling a strange and unfamiliar pang of guilt as she read the glowing commendations from his former commanding officers. Words like unflappable grace under fire, uncompromising integrity, and fierce loyalty to his team seemed to describe a man from another species. She found a local news article about his wife, a beloved elementary school teacher who had passed away suddenly 3 years prior. And through a public social media profile of a relative, she found picture after picture of his daughter, Sophie, at school plays, at ballet recitals, on his shoulders, at a county fair. In every photo, he was looking at his daughter with a look of such pure, unadulterated love that it made Madeline feel physically cold. She started to watch him, not with the eye of a CEO, but with the curiosity of an anthropologist studying an alien life form. From the detached, sterile distance of her executive perch, she'd see him in the crowded cafeteria, not eating, but on a video call with Sophie, his face transformed by a gentle smile as he patiently walked his daughter through a tricky math problem. She saw how younger colleagues, junior engineers barely out of college, would approach him with a question, and how he'd stop whatever he was doing to pull up a schematic and explain a complex system with quiet patience, treating everyone, from janitors to junior executives, with the exact same unassuming respect. Each observation was a small, precise cut in the armor she had spent a lifetime building. She started to draw sharp, painful comparisons between his life and hers. That night, after a grueling 14-hour day of corporate warfare, she went home to her sterile, silent penthouse. The art was chosen by a designer, the furniture was brutally minimalist, and the silence was absolute. It was a museum to her success, and it was as cold and empty as a tomb. She realized with a sickening clarity that all of her relationships were transactions. Her father's approval was a transaction she was perpetually failing to complete. Her friendships were strategic alliances. Her romantic encounters were temporary mergers. Daniel's life, by every financial and material measure, was impoverished compared to hers. But she was beginning to see that his life was rich in a way she couldn't comprehend. Genuine, unconditional connection. He wasn't working for a bonus or a promotion. He was working for that gap-toothed smile in his wallet, and for the first time in her adult life, the Ice Queen felt a thaw. It was a terrifying, unfamiliar, and deeply unsettling feeling that felt dangerously close to envy. A week later, the unfamiliar feelings churning inside her became too much to bear. Madeline manufactured a reason, a flimsy pretext about reviewing new fail-safe protocols to go down to the generator room. As she expected, Daniel was there, performing routine diagnostics, moving with that same focused calm that now fascinated rather than infuriated her. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with the memory of her challenge and his refusal. She tried to slip back into her CEO persona, the armor she knew so well, but the authoritative words felt foreign and clumsy in her own mouth. "Mr. Reed," she began, her voice tighter than she wanted, "I wanted to personally ensure the new fail-safes you installed are performing to specification." "They are, Ms. Pierce," he said, not missing a beat in his work. He didn't look up at first, his attention still on the readouts. Exceeding them, in fact. The bypass you witnessed was a stopgap. This new system is fully redundant. He spoke to her not as a subordinate to a boss, but as a colleague, an equal. He proceeded to explain the technical adjustments he'd made, the intricate dance of circuits and software he had designed to prevent a similar failure. His passion for the machine, for making it perfect, was evident in his voice. He wasn't trying to impress her. He was simply sharing his work, assuming she would be interested in the substance of it. It was the most honest, unfiltered conversation she'd had in years. She found herself asking questions, not about cost or timelines, but about how it worked, about the logic behind his choices. For 20 minutes, they were just two people talking about a machine, her title and his uniform dissolving into the shared language of engineering. The final, inevitable collision came a month later, at the annual Axiom Energy Christmas Gala, a lavish affair held in a downtown ballroom. Madeline was in her element, a queen holding court, effortlessly navigating the currents of power, schmoozing investors, and smiling at rivals. But her heart wasn't in it. Her gaze kept drifting to the edges of the room, searching, and then she found him. Daniel was there, a condition of his miracle worker status, looking profoundly uncomfortable in a rented tuxedo. He was standing with a small group of technicians, a small island of authenticity in a sea of ambition. Her father, a man who radiated a chilling aura of disappointment, cornered her by the bar. "Madeline, your Triton success was adequate," he said, the word a backhanded compliment that felt like a slap. "But you've grown soft, sentimental." His cold eyes scanned the room and landed on Daniel's group with undisguised disdain. "You need to spend less time worrying about the hired help and more time consolidating power. The Henderson merger is stalling because you're not applying enough pressure." His dismissive, callous tone was the spark that ignited the fuse. All the frustration, the loneliness, and the new confusing emotions that had been churning inside her for weeks erupted. This was her life, a constant, grueling test, a game she could never truly win, run by men who saw people as pawns on a balance sheet. She looked at her father's cold, calculating face, and then across the grand ballroom at Daniel Reed, a man who lived by a code of honor and love that these powerful men would never, ever understand. In that singular, crystallizing moment, she made a choice. She excused herself from her father's suffocating presence with a curt nod, leaving him mid-sentence. She walked directly across the polished marble floor. A murmur followed her as the crowd, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, parted before her. She walked straight to Daniel, who looked up, startled, as the CEO of the company bore down on his quiet corner. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice clear and strong, resonating in the sudden hush, "I never properly thanked you. You didn't just save a project that day. You reminded me of something I had forgotten, what real integrity looks like." She then turned, her gaze sweeping across the room until it found her father. "And you," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound power that was entirely her own. are a man I no longer wish to impress. She faced the stunned audience, a sea of shocked faces. Effective immediately, I am resigning as CEO of Axiom Energy. Gasps and frantic whispers rippled through the ballroom. Before anyone could react, she turned back to Daniel. A small, genuine, and slightly terrified smile touched her lips for the very first time. "Mr. Reed," she said softly, so only he could hear, "would you walk me out of here?" She held out her hand, a simple, open, and vulnerable gesture. After a beat of stunned hesitation, in which he saw not a CEO but a woman taking a terrifying leap of faith, Daniel took it. His large, warm hand enveloped hers. Together they turned their backs on the chaos and walked out of the ballroom, leaving behind an empire of ice and a world of stunned silence. They stepped out into the cold night air, not toward an ending, but toward a new, unknown, and infinitely hopeful beginning. Stories of unexpected connection can change everything. If you believe in second chances and want more narratives that touch the heart, hit that subscribe button and join our community. Your support lets us keep telling these stories, and they didn't look back. The fallout from Madeline's resignation was seismic. News headlines screamed of the corporate chaos. Her board of directors imploded, and her father disowned her via a clipped, formal email from his lawyer, but she felt none of it. For the first time in her life, she was free from the crushing weight of expectation. They married quietly 6 months later in a small courthouse ceremony. Sophie, beaming in a dress Madeline had helped her pick out, acted as the flower girl and the sole witness, dropping the rings twice in her excitement. The Ice Queen was gone, melted away, replaced by a woman who was learning how to laugh from her belly, how to find profound joy in small, ordinary moments, and how to love without fear or calculation. They merged their worlds, not just their lives. With Madeline's brilliant, strategic business mind and Daniel's technical genius and unwavering ethical compass, they started a small, sustainable energy company from their garage. It wasn't a global titan. Their mission wasn't to dominate markets, but to serve communities. They specialized in bringing clean, affordable power to schools, local businesses, and rural areas left behind by the corporate giants. It was work with purpose, building something that mattered on a human scale. 5 years later, you could find them not in a sterile boardroom, but on the sun-drenched roof of a community center in a low-income neighborhood, installing solar panels side by side. Daniel led the technical operations, his quiet competence and patient teaching style inspiring a new generation of young engineers they'd hired. Madeline handled the business, building partnerships, not empires, and discovering a talent for connecting with people she never knew she had. She had learned to value people over profits and found it infinitely more rewarding. Sophie, now a bright young girl with a passion for robotics and her father's methodical mind, would often join them on weekends, her laughter echoing across the rooftops as she handed her dad wrenches. They had built a family, a business, and a life, not on the shifting sands of power and ambition, but on the solid bedrock of mutual respect, quiet integrity, and a love that had unexpectedly sparked to life in the shadow of a broken machine. Madeline Pierce had once challenged a single dad, contemptuously offering a kiss as a prize. What she got in return was something far greater, something she never knew she needed, the chance to fix not just a generator, but her own broken soul.